American economist Professor Jeffrey Sachs has sparked global conversation after suggesting that a possible US setback at the G20 could signal a shift in global power. Speaking at UNISA's 2025 Founders Lecture, Sachs warned that while US influence may be weakening, it still remains a powerful and potentially dangerous global actor. What does all this mean for Africa's sovereignty and the future of global politics? We're not here to break it down for you. That is the job of the Commission of Inquiry and global policy experts. We are simply giving you the heads up on what is happening.
Said he had assigned the CIA to operations inside Venezuela, and a week later, suddenly the biggest refinery blows up. So the United States can hardly go a week at a time without trying to kill somebody. But China actually goes centuries without attacking its neighbors. So China went for 1,000 years without once invading Japan, a near neighbor, even though China was much more powerful. Incidentally, from 2 times, there was an attempt to invade Japan from the Chinese mainland, but that was when China had been conquered by the Mongols. So 800 years ago, roughly, they tried twice. The Mongols tried to invade Japan, and they were defeated both times. But the Chinese never tried. The Japanese actually, sadly, invaded China many times, but never the other way around. And the Chinese never invaded Korea. And the Chinese did invade Vietnam once, but that was 615 years ago. And then they had a skirmish for 1 month in 1979. Other than that, that's the so-called enemy of the United States. So that's why I call it a neurosis. China's the least threat possible. Doesn't threaten anybody. Doesn't attack anybody, hasn't been in any war for 46 years, and the war that it was in 46 years ago lasted 1 month. That's when Vietnam toppled a government in Cambodia that China viewed as an ally, and so it punished Vietnam for a month for having overthrown their ally in Cambodia. Other than that, no wars for more than 4 decades. But we're in a funk because the American idea is you have to be number one so you can boss everyone else around. And by the way, we learned every trick we know from the British, who did that for 200 years before that. So that's where the geopolitics comes in. What Adam Smith is saying in 1776 is we need to look forward to a future in which there is equal force, mutual respect, social justice. And we're at that hinge moment of history. Because to my way of thinking, we are at the end of 3 major cycles. First, with these momentous discoveries that Adam Smith talked about, these sea routes that the Europeans found, that began a period of European ascent in the world history and world economy, because Europe was nothing special economically or geopolitically in 1500. You would not put it as likely to succeed or to dominate. But those events changed the course of events. Then in 1750 and really in 1776, oddly enough, the same year that Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, a very skilled engineer, we would say today, but he didn't have that title, a man named James Watt, working at the University of Glasgow, fittingly at a university, stuck a condenser on a steam engine that had been invented decades before, and suddenly the steam engine became incredibly efficient, low cost, and suddenly the industrial age was feasible because of that great invention of the steam engine. That happened, that commercial steam engine of James Watt, which is why we talk about megawatts today, because of Mr. Watt and the power that his steam engine brought. That came in 1776, and Britain was the first country to industrialize, and it really did beat up the rest of the world after that, because the industrialization, the power that came with that, the industrial military led to a worldwide imperialism that dominated the 19th and the first part of the 20th century. And at its apogee, the British Empire had 1/4 of all the people in the world under British imperial domination. Of course, India was a big part of that 25% of humanity. So that's the second part of a cycle. And then, because Europe has a very hard time making peace within Europe. It's really a sickness, actually, I'm sorry to say. We love Europe. My wife's born in Europe, my family comes from Europe, but they fight each other so much. Not my wife and me, but every two countries bear a grudge. Yesterday, I was texting with a friend of mine who wrote to me because he was giving a lecture in Poland, in Warsaw. And I said, yes, it's so sad, the hatred of Russia in Poland. And he said, oh, but remember what Russia did. And he said, you have to remember, in 1792, that's what he wrote. And I wrote, get over it. You don't have to fight every time, because in 1792, you fought because the Russians would say, yes, 1792, but in 1610, you invaded us. And that's true, by the way. Poland started it. When Russia was in trouble, in so-called times of trouble in 1610, it was Poland that invaded Russia. Then Russia invaded Poland 150 years later, and on, and they can't stop. And there is, by the way, there's the famous saying of the philosopher George Santayana, the Spanish philosopher of the 20th century, that those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. And my wife has a better one, though. Sonia says those who remember history are condemned to repeat it, because all you do is you bear a grudge for 1,000 years. Get over it. So I think that so I was going to say Europe destroyed itself in 2 civil wars, which we call World War I and World War II. And by the end of the Second World War, Europe was so broken that decolonization came. Not, by the way, because it was inevitable had there not been the wars, but Britain was bankrupt at the end of 1945, after 2 world wars. And Europe had lost any claim whatsoever, not that it deserved it ever, but any claim that it was a civilizing mission or anything else. Not only was it a completely reckless and cruel incivility of the imperial age, but they couldn't even within Europe behave with any decency, and slaughtered tens of millions of people. So at the end of World War II, imperialism wasn't quite over, though. Europe lost its colonies step by step. Sometimes there were wars of decolonization in Africa. Sometimes it went more quickly and somewhat peacefully. It all depended. But there was one more empire that was going to stand, and that was the United States empire, because the U.S. became a world empire, and not only a world empire in 1945, and again, having learned the tricks of the trade from Britain, it was a world empire that aspired to dominate the world. And the policy of the United States was there should be no rival. So this was not quite possible because one major power, the Soviet Union itself, did not want to be dominated by the United States. And rather than making peace between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which were allies in World War II, remember that, they were allies. The U.S. and Britain said, we're enemies of our ally, the one that had actually broken the back of Hitler's army, because the Soviet people lost 27 million in World War II. They bore the brunt of World War II. They defeated Hitler, but the U.S. and Britain did not know how to make peace. They said the Soviet Union's the new enemy, and a Cold War emerged. And I put a lot of the responsibility on the U.S. side for this, because what Russia or the Soviet Union wanted was for Germany to be demilitarized and neutral. And the United States said, no, Germany will be remilitarized and part of our new military alliance, NATO. And the Soviet Union said, now you're a threat to us again. And that led to decades of Cold War. So we lost what could have been the peace. But the United States saw the Soviet Union as, of course, the enemy. The Soviet economic system was not so great, and the U.S. was out to break it in any event through controls on technology and isolation, containment it was called. And as of 1991, the Soviet Union had an economic collapse, and it collapsed into 15 successor states. And I mention this because at that moment, the United States said, oh my God, now we made it. We're alone. We run the world. And believe me, that's how they felt. And that was an illusion, a delusion. They thought Russia, that's a nothing. And they thought China, don't they grow rice there? That's an impoverished country of villages. We don't even have to worry about that. We are the sole superpower of the world. Well, that's not how economics works, actually, because Adam Smith's insight is completely right, which is that if you are fortunate to have open trade, peace, and good economic policies, you get a lot of catching up by the transmission of knowledge, technology, and the opportunities for rapid advance. So while the United States wasn't watching, and I know they weren't watching because they're not very clever there in Washington, I have to tell you, and they don't understand much of economics at all. They weren't paying attention, but China was growing at 10% per year, thank you. And if you do that, you double the size of your economy every 7 years. And if you do that for 35 years, which China did, you've doubled 5 times. And doubling 5 times means you've grown 32 times.